Welcome to the RSP cast. I'm Matt Waldman, author of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. I'm an NFL outsider, but my evaluation of skill prospects has earned the attention of NFL insiders. For the next 45 minutes, I'm going to share my process, analysis, and stories of the game within the game. All right, we're going to kick off the segment on craft with a conversation about evaluation with my friend and colleague whose work you've seen on NFL Network, NFL.com, The Fantasy Footballers, and FootballGuys.com. He's Matt Harmon, the author of the fantastic Reception Perception. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Oh, Waldman, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's here Saturday in the morning on the best side of the country. Sorry for the haters out there, but on the best side of the country, just inputted some reception perception data for Michael Crabtree, which I think is a really poignant time for poignant player for what we're going to talk about here today. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. And, I can't argue with you about the Pacific Ocean, at least. So, speaking of that, for anyone who's, maybe got rescued from a deserted island or recently crawled out of a survivalist shelter or maybe, returned somewhat unscathed from their alien abduction, can you give those people, the cocktail party explanation of reception perception before we dig into it for anybody unfamiliar?
Sure. Yeah. So what reception perception is it's my personal evaluation method for evaluating the wide receiver position. It's a charting methodology I came up with about almost 4 or 5 years ago now at this point, when I decided to start writing about football, because what I thought was really missing in the space was, telling the story of the wide receiver beyond the influence of the quarterback. A wide receiver can run great routes all throughout the game and just never get the ball thrown his way for whatever reason. And so I wanted to go in and chart each individual route that a receiver runs over a sample of games for NFL and eventually college prospects to really see where they win. What routes do they get the most separation on? What type of coverages are they most successful? Man, zone, press, essentially. Whatever you want to know about a wide receiver, reception perception is probably going to tell you about that. So I've been doing this for the last 3 draft classes and the last 4 NFL seasons. And, everybody always asks me on these podcasts, what's changed about your process over the years? And it's funny, the way I chart the games isn't really different over the last 4 years, but what I know about it and what I feel like it tells me has changed, drastically each year, because with more years and more data comes more knowledge and understanding of your process. And I think that I'm sure you can relate to, like, that's probably the most fun thing. Like what I would say about a player, like with, quote unquote negative data now is very, very different from what I would have said probably 3 years ago when I started doing prospects.
Yeah, it just becomes more nuanced because of the history that you get there. And as you can see, with, Matt and I both study film, we both chart what we see, we both analyze results. And that's where, reception perception and the rookie scouting portfolio have commonalities. And today, I think what we're going to do is just talk about some of the differences, because that's going to make great conversation about the craft of evaluation. And that's what this segment really is about. And because Matt and I have those different processes, it's natural that we're going to have different perspectives on a player. And, one of the guys that I read about I read his analysis and I knew that we were way different with in certain respects was Dante Pettis. And I thought that'd be a great starting point. And it was also suggested to me this morning by Matthew Klugman. So, when another Matt gets into the conversation, and an academic from Australia who's like, I follow Matt Harmon, I follow Matt Waldman, and I would love to hear you guys talk about what your process is. I thought it was a great idea, so that's what we're going to do. So Matt, you've watched 6 of Pettis's games to accumulate your alignment and target data, and you measured his success rate against coverage. And one of the things that I don't do with my process is measure alignment information. So why is that important for you? And what does that tell us? Let's just start with that.
Sure. There's like 30 different Matts in the field. So just a little heads up to anybody out there. If your name is Matt and you want to get in the fantasy industry or football analysis, probably want to go with a name change real quick. That's one starting point. But I love that you asked this question and that we decided to talk about the alignment data, because, it's so often overlooked, I think, especially when we're doing weekly matchups. for fantasy, like, okay, well, this wide receiver lines up at the left wide receiver position. 50% of the time he's going to be going against this cornerback who gives up this pass rating versus coverage. And like, we know where players line up, but I think what I'm discovering more and more as I go throughout this charting process with reception perception and also working with our next gen stats tracking data at the NFL Network, where players line up is hugely important and influential on how they not only play out with their production, just in terms of accumulating raw counting stats, but also how they produce in a series like reception perception that charts their separation. Players that line up in the slot frequently, their separation numbers are different than players that line up outside. And especially when you see, like I tweeted this out a little while ago about number one wide receivers lining up inside in the slot and just how much more efficient those targets are, because, and I think that we know this intuitively, but seeing it in a quantifiable form, separation increases in the middle of the field. The amount of press targets or contested targets or tight window targets, those are all much less frequent in the middle of the field when you run routes out of the slot. So I think that it makes a huge difference. It can really influence how a player scores out in reception perception. One example that I am always want to give from here going forward, like a player like Juju Smith-Schuster didn't show up all that well in reception perception in his final year, in the sample of games I charted from his USC tape. But he was obviously a really, really good rookie receiver for the Steelers this past year. And looking back on it, how he lined up in the NFL versus how he lined up in college was so different. At USC, he was a primary X receiver. And what that means is he was lining up on one side of the field, on the line of scrimmage, facing a lot of press coverage. And, that wasn't really the strength of his game to me. His separation numbers did not show up really well. However, when you transpose that to how the Steelers used him, he was often lined up off the line of scrimmage. He was used from the slot and at the flanker position when he lined up outside. And that was just much more conducive to his game, running those short to intermediate routes and creating separation in that way. And I've just noticed that is a huge, huge difference for players. Like, there are a lot of receivers that don't produce efficiently because of how they get lined up. And I think that's something that this data can really show us. And it's something that honestly more teams should exploit going forward. Two examples in the NFL of two receivers that I think are used fantastically in this way are Michael Thomas and Keenan Allen, guys that are used about 35 to 40% of their targets come from the slot. And those are more efficient targets. They're able to move the ball against less tight window targets, press coverage, etc. So that's something that I've really learned over the past 2 years, especially with this alignment data.
And I love how you explain this, because when you mentioned that it's intuitive oftentimes, and I think that's because when we think about just the X's and O's and how players play each other based on where they're located, it's important. I mean, it's intuitive, but we can break it down and say, listen, if you're playing in the slot, you're matched up with a linebacker or a safety or a nickel corner or a dime corner, and they also have run responsibilities that are a little greater than the guy who's playing outside the hash. So as a result of that, there's going to be some natural – it's going to be natural that you won't see as much press coverage in that area of the field, because they have to account for the fact that they have to defend the run a little bit more, or they have to be more cognizant about what's happening on the line of scrimmage. They're either in the city or in the suburbs, whereas, the guy on the outside is quote unquote on the island. So, as a result, your focus is going to be different. And when you talk, and it was such a great point for you to talk about Juju Smith-Schuster and Michael Thomas, because those are guys that, they fit that, they're fitting in well in that spread formation. The more use of the spread in the NFL, and with that spread, you get those 3 receiver sets, more 4 receiver sets, and in the fact that they're using them in that capacity, the way that you explain that's fantastic. So, where does the boundary? Where does it begin to be more or less useful? I think you answered that fairly well, to a degree, but let's talk about, say, Pettis's game and talk about, what his alignment information tells you, and what does it tell us, in terms of those boundaries that you mentioned, where, with Juju Smith-Schuster as an example, does his apply in any way like that?
Yeah, Pettis was a guy that in the games that I sampled only lined up in the slot on 11.6% of his snaps, which is, that's not very much. There's definitely, I think, a player that he'd probably fit more in this mold in the NFL as a guy who, like a Juju Smith-Schuster, would probably run, maybe 60-40% of his routes and favoring more coming from the inside. So I do think that that's a worthwhile projection to talk about. Again, like it does feel a lot like that Juju Smith-Schuster example from last year, whereas, it didn't show up all that well in reception perception, but I think the way he lines up probably has something to do with it. Now, when I talk about on the line of scrimmage versus behind the line of scrimmage, not to get too like X's and O's football heavy, like,
please do.
But it's like, sometimes I don't want to talk babble about this sort of stuff. But when you in order for your formation to be legal, you got to have two eligible receivers is on the line of scrimmage, like with their foot literally on it, and then the rest of the guys got to be off it. Like people can't, and they can't be right next to each other. It's got to be, it's usually the tight end on one side of the field, and then that split end receiver is on the left side of the field or right side of the field, whatever, depending on where the tight end lines up. It's not always the case. That's not universal, but that's often, if you're just running 11 personnel with the tight end and 3 receivers, that's typically what you're going to see. And then the rest of the guys, like I said, they're about a yard or two off the line of scrimmage. And that can vary, but I think that's crucial. The more that I've studied players, the more that I think that matters. A player like Stephon Diggs, is a good example of a guy that this past season often didn't line up as that X receiver. It's funny, the two biggest players in their passing game in terms of Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, neither one of them really lined up on the line of scrimmage all that much. It was like the throwaway guy, the Laquan Treadwell or the Michael Floyd, like, oh, those guys can be X receivers and just run against top corners and number one and get a bunch of press and just really not even go mess around with those guys. And then these two players, much more efficient producers. And I don't think that means that you can't be a number one or whatever, but I do think that it's just crucial for these players that don't have to then run up against press corners a lot. And Pettis took 57% of his snaps, so the majority from behind the line of scrimmage. And I think that's going to be crucial for him, in the NFL too, to be used in that same capacity.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation, and it gives you a really clear idea of where the NFL is heading to counter. Offenses are heading to further get an advantage against defenses in the passing game. Is that, let's throw, Laquan Treadwell, a guy I really liked when I evaluated him as an X receiver, and it's like you see the flashes with him, but at the same time, it's like, why are we going to throw to the guy who has the harder job when we can get a quick, easy target with somebody else, who's going to have an easier job, maybe at the line of scrimmage at least? And
that's so true. And I don't know if you agree with this, but I said this about this draft, that I really thought it was like an inflection point draft to me, because I think the game, like, it's changed so much. I've been doing this quote unquote semi-professionally or very quote unquote professionally the last 4 years. I started Backyard Banter and Reception Perception, all that, about in the 2014, end of 2013 going into 2014. So the last like 4 seasons, I think the game has just changed so dramatically in that time alone, much less like 10, 15 years ago. And I think the way we evaluate players now has to be that, like, it has to start changing. Like, I thought there were some criticisms levied at certain prospects that just really don't apply to the game anymore. Or like players, like a Roquan Smith, I think can be like a transformative figure in a defense now because of the way teams are targeting the running backs more, tight ends more in the middle of the field. And those players like Deion Jones with the Falcons that, 10 years ago wouldn't have even been considered as a starting linebacker because of their size, but what he can do against the pass is huge now. And I think like this change in the way football is done, I don't think it's like, I think it's the new wave. I don't think it's a blip on the radar. Teams like you said, the Vikings are a great example of some of those players being the engine of their offense. I mean, the Rams, like, their ex receiver was Sammy Watkins, and he was like an afterthought, a complete afterthought. And I think it's no surprise those two offenses, were some of the better ones in the league. Even the Eagles, like, their ex-receiver was Alshon Jeffrey, obviously, but he was kind of just a role player for them this past year, where they got a lot of efficient targets from Zach Ertz, from Nelson Aguilar as a slot receiver. And I just think that is the way the NFL is going. And I think that the more and more we have to value that with wide receiver prospects, especially.
Yeah, I agree. Because I mean, it's funny, as you're into the process, you're kind of in the forest or in the weeds, and you're not really looking, you're examining individuals so much that you have these aha moments as you're going through it. And often it's because you're looking at something and you feel like it conflicts with the old ways that you've been doing it, or at least the old ways that you've analyzed information. And that was definitely the case for me this year when I'm, a little lower on Cortland Sutton. I'm a lot lower on Equinemius St. Brown. I'm a lot lower on all these big receivers. And I'm sitting here because year after year, I'm watching Michael Thomas, who I rated highly, or Cooper Kupp, who I liked, or Juju Smith-Schuster, and thought that he could be sneaky good if they put him here. And you're always trying to think of, well, where does he win? Where is he going to succeed? As we give our Josh Norris, tip of the cap to. And as you start doing that more and more and seeing success with it, you're thinking, wow, there's still guys who were rating, Equinemius St. Brown in the top 5, and I can't justify it. Like, I can't get anywhere near that. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, and it's always a conflict because you want to be true to your evaluation, but you're wondering, what am I seeing differently, and is that going to be wrong? And, that's okay. But, you're trying to be on top of why you might be wrong with that so that you can give good analysis and give a balanced analysis about it. And so then to see the NFL embrace that to the degree that it did. And I, just like you, I've been kind of telling people this class, there are a lot of kind of combo slot outside guys, big slot or little slot, who can play outside, inside, and be moved around a bit and can get a lot of good production in the same vein as the guys that we just talked about. And to see that kind of come to fruition, while logically I should go, I'm not surprised because it's logical. It should happen that way. The fact that the NFL actually did it shocked me. I was, so.
And the best teams, I think, are at least this past season, I find myself, like, the more I do this professionally, I don't really care as much about, rooting for certain teams. I just want to see smart decisions and, rooting for good, because I think we all get better. We all watch better games if the teams are smarter. I mean, that just makes sense. So I love the fact that some of the stuff that we're talking about was implemented by some of the best teams. And, of course, the Patriots have been implementing this for like the past 5-8 years. So they're kind of constantly ahead of the curve on this. But yeah, it's great to see teams kind of embracing that. And I think for fantasy owners or people trying to talk about the game, I think this information is crucial because, again, you can tell. I love the idea. Chris Wessling talks about like litmus test players and, how these players, like, you can tell who's watching the games based on how they talk about these players. But I think some of these concepts like this are going to be there. Those are like litmus test ideas, like who's paying attention to the way the league is going, not where it has been. Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about target data. So, someone who has a process for measuring receivers, I look at targets and I'll chart them. For me in the rookie scouting portfolio, I look at targets thrown, targets caught, targets dropped, missed targets, targets caught versus contact, and targets dropped versus contact. And, I define some of those things in my glossary in specifics of how I do that. But tell us a little bit about how you track target data and reception perception, and what do you feel like or don't know about Pettis' game based on it?
Yeah, target data is probably, I would say, the thing I think about the least, because like the whole point to me of reception perception is going beyond just the targeted plays. For example, Pettis through the 6 games I charted, he had 49 targets, but he ran 152 routes. And I think you learn just as much about the player on those on the majority of those 152 routes, as opposed to just the 49 plays I saw him get thrown to. Now, I do think that influence of the quarterback is essential to, especially when, you know, you're fortunate like me and you work with the NFL Network and you get access to all 22 and you can see all of the routes and everything. You learn a lot about how the player interacts with the football, and especially this is where you see the influence of the quarterback, because I think it's very tempting for a lot of people to see a player win contested catches or have a lot of, you know, what you said, like targets with contact, however you want to define that. And I think that people make assumptions based off that, you know, that, oh, well, this guy wins a lot of contested catches, but so that must mean he can't separate well. That's not always necessary. That's definitely, well, I'm not even gonna say that's not necessarily, that's definitely not always the case. I've studied this like statistically, and there's very little correlation with separation to percentage of targets contested, because this is where you see the influence of the quarterback. Because the fact that a receiver gets a contested catch or a target with little separation, that it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't run a good route or they didn't do, like that they're at fault, because a lot of times quarterbacks can throw their targets into contested situations by an inaccurate pass or what have you. Or this is what they're supposed to be doing, you know, that this is supposed to be a high leverage target. It also just matters where you're thrown at. If you're thrown at in the red zone, it's more likely that you're going to register a contested catch attempt. Or if you're thrown at to the boundary, you're going to get probably a contested catch attempt registered to you. And I would say the best example of this is this past season. In looking at the guys I have right now, one of the highest players in terms of percentage of their targets as a contested catch was Stephon Diggs, who I think we can all assume, or we all know, and I would say reception perception quantifies, is one of the best route runners in the game. It gets incredible separation. So that just, you know, that just kind of goes to show you that that little dichotomy there. And so I think you learn a lot from the plays where you see the targets, but there's also so much more to learn even beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that plays into a lot of things that, you know, we look at, and you have a lot of data heavy analysis based on the film. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, and which is great. And I think that's, you know, it's something that's, you know, fans find very much appealing and analysts find very appealing. But then you have that dichotomy sometimes that people create where they talk about, you know, film work and coaching and qualitative discussion about things as if it's like on a different planet. But what bleeds into this and how we merge this is you talk about a guy like Stephon Diggs or Marvin Jones or someone who, you know, someone like Marvin Jones who runs that, you know, 4.4, mid 4.4 40. And when people look at the 40-yard dash and say, oh, he's not fast enough to be a vertical receiver. He's fast enough to play in the vertical game, but he's not a deep threat. You know, you'll hear these types of kind of quantitative discussion or narrative about a player. And I've always thought, based on, you know, listening to coaches and talking with them and trying to learn about the game and the process of route running, that really we often emphasize, you know, the more the better, you know, and when it comes to the combine or it comes to any type of workout measurable, it's like, if he's taller, it's better. If he's faster, it's better. If he runs, you know, if he's in the 98th percentile instead of the 78th percentile, then that's better. And the thought to me is those are just raw materials in the many cases. So it's like, it's just a raw material for what makes them good as a route runner or not. And a coach would say, it's not how fast a player runs, it's how fast he stops. Yeah. And that's a technical thing. And you know, there's that tape I've talked about on other podcasts where that was on YouTube of a college coach showing two receivers, both running, I think they were running a curl, and they had, you know, one who was like a 4.3 receiver and the other was a 4.8 receiver. Mm-hmm. And you could just see how much faster the 4.8 receiver played than the 4.3 guy because of the presence of technique. So in the NFL, you may be looking at a certain baseline of speed or quickness and certain things. But once they're tall enough, fast enough, quick enough to ride the ride, it doesn't matter how much more is there unless their technique is fantastic in addition to that speed. And so, you know, the way that you talk about this is great because we look at how all that kind of pairs up, and you realize that in today's NFL and with the types of routes that are run and the context of where they're going to run them, sometimes it's going to matter that you're going to have somebody glued to your back or coming at you, or, have their hands on you, and you're open, and it was those little movements. It was those techniques. It's that ability that Diggs has, that Jones has, to earn the right position, knowing that that he's done the right thing to get there, and that he's just quick enough. And that's fine. Anquan Boldin and Tony Gonzalez are different examples, but they're both guys that, as our buddy Eric Stoner would say, have old man game. And that old man game is someone who knows where to go, how to get there, and how to set up the guy. Even though he doesn't look open, he's open all day long. And that's all technique and feel. And less athletic ability in terms of how it's emphasized.
Yeah. So there's so many things I don't want to jump off onto too many tangents off what you just said, but there's a lot of things I think that can really be fleshed out. One, I don't think like speed and route running, like, not the same. Like you can, I think people assume that if you're fast, you get a lot of separation, or if you're slow, you don't get a lot of separation. And I don't find I don't find that any of those things correlate well with each other. It's just, some players are good at route running and creating separation. Some are not. Some happen to be fast. Some happen to be slow. I don't think those have anything to do with anything. Not to mention, the farther I get into this, I don't really know that, I think the combine is important, no doubt about it, for certain things, but measuring on-field speed, I don't think it matters. Like, it doesn't make any sense to say that what a player runs in the 40 in a completely different condition from what they're going to be running on the field. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense just intuitively. And, that's just a whole nother conversation. But
yeah,
what you talk about with charting players too, like, and both of us do this, and why I think it's important is because, like, I don't believe in just trusting the film or trusting your eyes, because your eyes are very, very deceptive. And the way you emotionally react to what you see is very, very deceptive and influential to how you think about things. And that's why I do what I do, is because I don't think like I'm some great evaluator or I'm some great film watcher. What I think is that I go in and I just log everything I see. And over the wide sample of those routes, I think the truth about players is revealed through doing that, as opposed to just seeing, a cut up and reacting to it. But what that truth is, and this is kind of another point that you made in there, is not always a good or bad, like, pass fail type thing, and this is where a player like a Pettis comes into it, or a player in the past, who, like a Juju Smith-Schuster, or even some Marvin Jones is a great example of a guy that I think is really good, but doesn't have necessarily the greatest separation data in reception perception because of the role he plays or how he's used or whatever. And it doesn't really matter, because he's a great contested catch receiver, or great when he gets the ball in space and at other things. It's not like that I think that a player who doesn't have great separation is bad. It's understanding and trying to quantify where they fit and how they're going to succeed in the NFL and how they can be best deployed, because it's obvious that a player like Pettis or some of these other guys I have mentioned have skills. They obviously have something to bring to the table. And I think that seeing this data as it's laid out it's just more so about, okay, this is what they can't do, but let's find how they can be used in a way to exploit the skills that they obviously have.
Yeah. And I just love how you went about this, because as you can tell, if you've never heard Matt Harmon before or seen his work before, that you can tell that he has a very detailed process of how he looks at players. But, I find that the more process you have, the more nuance and gray areas you wind up seeing and accounting for. But what you're trying to do is to actually be able to get away from that. I do the same thing with the RSP. I mean, I have a huge glossary of how I define and watch everything I do, because that's the way that's my way of not just going by my eyes. Because otherwise I'd see big, fast, and a beautiful catch, and I'd go, they're great. That's awesome. I'm a fan. I love what I saw. And I'd ignore things, go into another position like running backs, guys who get 3 or 4 yard gains. If I didn't have this rigorous process for how I define decision making and technique. And if I didn't have that, I'd probably, all I would look at is 30, 40, 50-yard runs or a minimum of an 8-yard run to say that he was good or not. And now I find myself geeking out over like 2-yard losses to talk about how fantastic that play was. And that's why, guys, and that's why, the difference between, some fans who read my work or other analysts who study work and go, oh, Matt Waldman has Nick Chubb ranked number 1 as his top scored back in the past 5 years. I may not agree with that, but I know that he's appreciating certain nuances that are different than, 80-yard runs. And, and then you have fans who are like, who is that flipping idiot? I mean, so it's like, but what you outlined is so good because of that nuance there and touching upon Pettis. And that's, Pettis reminded me of Marvin Jones, that's kind of, so it makes sense that when we look at your process and you see what he can or can't do, that it also, it has some parallels to what you also see and don't see in Marvin Jones' game in that regard. So, one of the other things that I think that's different about our process is that you're charting the success or failure of an individual route, where I'm breaking down the presence or absence or success and failure of the process from the route to the catch. What I really like about your process, Matt, is that it gives a clear understanding of the routes where a guy succeeded and it shows how they may match up in a new offense. And I think you've discussed how that would be the case, in a number of ways. But how have you found this to be helpful to discuss a player's future usage and success, and use Pettis as an example for that?
Yeah, it's funny when, I knew that we disagreed about Pettis when I wrote the piece that I did.
Right.
And that's why it's literally titled, Dante Pettis and the Eye of the Beholder, because a lot of this stuff is, what do you value? What do you see? And how important do you think that is? And then when I read your work in the RSP too, and you made that Marvin Jones comparison, I was like, that makes so much sense that that like a player I really like, right, like a Marvin Jones, who doesn't necessarily show out all that well in my process. And I'm gonna answer your question eventually before I was blabbering, but
I don't care. This is fun and it's so informative. And this is seriously, Matt Waldman's RSP cast. What do you think the show's going to be like, 5 minutes long?
Oh, very seriously, structured.
Go into it. Yeah.
I assume the structure and it like the thing that I thought when you were just talking a second ago, the thing that, again, I'm going to invoke Chris Wessling's name here. He was talking about this on the Around the NFL podcast not long ago, that the intention of analytics, and I would say a lot of, like, my work is very, very analytics heavy. What I do at the NFL Network with Next Gen Stats, very analytics heavy. What I'm doing with reception perception, trying to quantify qualitative film analysis, is analytics. But that's good. Obviously, I'm obviously heavy. Yeah. The heavy pro analytics. Like, if I ran a department, I would be very analytics heavy because it's how you make better decisions. The problem is, and he pointed this out, the problem is that because analytics is seen as like this pejorative term in the NFL, or it's like this, minority class in some ways, that I think a lot of people who use analytics have become very dogmatic about it. However, analytics have, in the intent of it, was to decrease dogmatic thinking or remove dogmatic thinking. And it's ironic that it's become this way. And I think that's so important for a player like a Pettis or what I was talking about earlier, whereas, so this player has a lower success rate versus man coverage, or, is average or below average against press. 3 years ago, when I started doing this, my thought would have been, oh, this player's not good. Like, that doesn't, he must be bad. And sometimes that's true. Like, don't get me wrong. Sometimes that's true. Justin Hunter being
but the film would tell you that too, without
the fact that he's the first and second percentile against man in press coverage. I think that shows you something. However, like, that's not always the case. And that's where removing some of that dogma and that dogmatic thinking is really important, because it's not a pass-fail situation. Football is much like life. It's far too nuanced to be viewed that way. And so I think where this, again, blabbering, trying to get to a point here, with Pettis in particular, I think that's where you look at some of the routes that he runs, and a player can only be successful or unsuccessful in the assignment that they're given. And with a player like Pettis, again, I would view him much more as a guy that is used situationally. I know John Lynch on NFL Network said that they liked Pettis because they view him as somebody that can play all three wide receiver positions. And I agree with that. I think that he would be best used, based on the routes that I've looked at and the way he succeeds, obviously in the open field. He's only brought down on first contact on 50% of his plays in space, which is a solid number, and also solid in contested situations too, converted 5 of 7 attempts. I think there are situations where you would use him. Now, I don't think he's somebody that you would line up at X receiver exclusively and funnel an offense through. But I think there are positions, if you get him out in space, if you decrease some of that contact, facing press coverage, because I do think that's the weakest point of his game. In terms of reception perception, that was his release moves might be great from the line of scrimmage, and I think that's where maybe you and I might differ on that. Like,
right.
You really value that process of seeing the release executed really well, whereas for me, it's more like, all right, did you get open or, did you not? And that's where my analysis comes in. And I think that's where you can say, like, okay, yeah, he might be able to have, it's not like he's got a 0% success rate versus press coverage. Obviously, you see some flashes of it, but the fact that that's not the strength of his game, then that's where you ask yourself, if you're a Kyle Shanahan, where do I deploy this player now to exploit the skills he obviously does have? So I think that's where this analysis really, like, our differences, it could be really helpful. And this is why, this is why front offices, or at least good ones, aren't, dictated by a monarch. They value a lot of different players in the room, or a lot of different voices in the room on players. I would recommend everybody actually to listen to the podcast that the Ravens website put out, interviewing now GM Eric DaCosta. And the amount of transparency he gave in that interview was really fascinating. And it was just cool to see, like, how everybody's voice kind of plays into it, and it's not like, all right, well, Ozzie likes this guy, so we're just going to take him. It's more about what do the coaches say and everything. And I think that if you and I were working for a team, if you were the Ozzie Newsome to my Eric DaCosta or whatever, not only would we talk about our different processes and how that would influence a player like Pettis, whether we were going to take him or not, we would discuss that, but we'd also discuss it with our coaches and how do you plan on deploying this player based on this information? And again, kind of babbling is where I'm going with it.
Yeah, but it would be one whole we'd make it one process. We'd make it a multi-tiered process where we go, okay, well, the route data and separation data says this, but the techniques show potential for improvement because he's got techniques. He just has to hone them. Whereas there's some guys who you're like, they're getting separation, but they don't have any technique for how to really do it on a consistent basis or don't show enough variety of it. So when you project, you're trying to project through that NFL lens and say, okay, well, what's going to happen when he faces a cornerback? Is he going to have a plan? Does he even have a plan? At least this guy may have a plan or not have a plan. And then it goes to the other part, which you said, he's not going to be an X receiver. Absolutely not. But is he going to be a Z? Is he going to be the flanker? And then we think about who've been good Zs, who've been primary Zs in the NFL. And you'd say, well, Jerry Rice was a Z, and Jerry Rice was in the West Coast offense. Well, we got a West Coast offense. And if they run him through as a Z or as a Z in a slot, then you've got something there. And that gives you, and you can kind of see how that might be one outcome that through a discussion of looking at, combining processes of what we both do, or it might be the other end of the spectrum where they go, okay, well, certainly he could probably play the Z here in time, but we're not quite there yet with him because even though he shows the techniques, he's not getting open on a level that we define as being open. Or it's projectable, but at this stage, we've got Pierre Garçon as our Z. That's going to work out well. He can work with him, but we can also use him in the slot right now and get some success with him, and then maybe, continue to work with him or him to work on becoming a better Z. And if he never gets there, we're okay because we feel like we're using more spread concepts with the with our West Coast offense with 3 receivers, and he can still be productive for us, and it warrants our pick. You know, that 2 totally different ways of how they may have come across this, and I'm sure there's a third that includes neither one of these they actually
Well, I
did.
think when I saw that Pettis goes to the 49ers, it made a lot of sense to me because I tweeted this quote out about Kyle Shanahan saying that, you know, when they didn't decide to pursue a wide receiver in free agency, or when they decided to pass on that free agent class, he talked about not needing, you know, that like that X receiver, like a Julio Jones, the true number one. The elite guys are great luxuries and they're awesome to have. And if you have them, you should keep them. But you know, sub Giants, don't forget this. If you have those players, you should keep them, but you don't necessarily need them, you know, because you can maximize players' role playing potential. And I think somebody like Pettis, they might not look at as, you know, maybe an immediate contributor, but they look at him as somebody that, okay, if Pierre Garçon has to come off the field, we're not going to have, you know, the 15 plays that Pettis takes a game at flanker, we're not going to see a big drop off. Or if Trent Taylor has to come off the field, we're not going to see a big drop off in the slot because Pettis is there. Or if, you know, Marcus Goodwin has to come off the field, we're not going to see a big drop off because we have Pettis who can play all of these positions and maximize the role playing potential there. So, you know, I think that's a really great point about it. And it just, again, it's all about, to me, it is all about alignment data, and where these players line up is so crucial to how much success or failure they have. I don't want to get into a side talk about the Raiders, but to me, that's one situation where I'm really watching that this year, because I think that.
Well, let's do for a little bit, and we'll wrap it up after that. You know, that's fine. I mean, I've been interested in them because everyone and their mama on Twitter has basically been bashing John Gruden. And as someone who is, while I know that John Gruden can wear on people in certain ways, especially players, and there's certain things about him, I laugh because I think about growing up, you know, way back in the 1970s when the Raiders and the Washington Redskins were like the over the hill gang type of teams that picked older veteran players. And people were like, they're washed up. And then next thing you know, they're contending for a Super Bowl during a 2 to 3 year window, and oftentimes end up being in the game. And when I look at some of the players they're acquiring and what they've been doing, it's very counter to what we've been told is the right way to go about it. And everyone says he's nuts and he's old and he's outside the game. But I've already been thinking there's going to be an article I'm going to be writing this summer, I'm sure, that will talk about the other side of that.
Yeah. Well, with the Raiders, like, I mean, with Gruden, like, yeah, I mean, I think he's nuts. I think he would wear, I think he would wear on me, no doubt about it. And he said some stuff. I mean, he's had some quotes that have gotten people annoyed, and I get that. But what I'm so fascinated by about their receiver core specifically is because I think like all of those players are due for role changes in terms of how they should be used this coming season. Like I just went back and looked at Michael Crabtree's game film for reception perception. I'm starting Jordy Nelson. I just went 2 games with him before we started talking. Obviously, you know, there's a reason I'm doing these 2 back to back. And the past few years, the coaching staff has had Amari Cooper as pretty much the primary X receiver, you know, like I said earlier, lining up on the line of scrimmage, facing a ton of press coverage. And I think he's probably better off as a Z receiver. But that's where they had Michael Crabtree. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I would have probably explored with making those 2 more interchangeable. If I was the 2017 Raiders coaching staff, I would have thought that you can, because those guys can, because Crabtree can definitely play X. You know, he's definitely good at that. And I love Crabtree. I'm such a big Crabtree fan. But I think he can play X. I think he can obviously play flanker. I think he will probably do a little bit more flanker going forward with the Ravens, but we'll see. But for Cooper, I think that one of the biggest struggles with him last season, besides the fact that he just can't win at the catch point, lowest contested catch conversion rate I've ever charted this past season for Amari Cooper. And those things can swing wildly year to year, but it's never been a strength of his game. Winning in tight spaces has never been the strength of his game. And I think that the Raiders would benefit by having him line up as the flanker. But then at the same time, like, I think Jordy Nelson needs to be that flanker hybrid slot receiver. There's 0% chance. Like, Amari Cooper might take another step and become that X receiver. I think Jordy Nelson at this point in his career has to be the Larry Fitzgerald type of big slot. And I think he can do that. I don't think he's as good as Crabtree anymore. I think Crabtree's the superior player at this point of their respective careers. But so at first I was like, man, that I don't see how that's going to work from a deployment perspective. Then they go out in the draft and trade a 3rd-round pick for Martavis Bryant. And I don't love the move because you give up a 3rd-round pick for a player that, has a lot of questions. Really, really good, but a lot of questions, and it is in the final year of his contract. So you could talk about it being questionable from that perspective, and I'd probably agree. But what I like is now they have a guy that I think they can play at X on the majority of the 3 wide receiver plays, have Cooper line up as the flanker, and have Jordy Nelson line up as the primary slot receiver. And now their receiver core suddenly looks better. Not to mention they also get one of my favorite sleepers at slot receiver in Ryan Switzer. So I love the Raiders receiving core now much more than I did probably a month ago. And it all comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where these players line up and the influence that has on the amount of separation they get and the amount of routes that they get targets on, and then, accrue production on. And, we can talk about all this nuance that we want to, but at the end of the day, and I said this on NFL Network with Patrick Claybon about a month ago, at the end of the day, it's not about how pretty you do it. It's not about all this. It's about accruing production, because production leads to points, and points lead to wins. And that's what it all comes down to. So, and that's why I think all this stuff matters in terms of where these players line up. And I think the Raiders are a good example.
That's fantastic. And I have nothing more to add, because it was just that
first
was
time anybody's ever said that.
And, Matt, this was fun. It was so informative. This was definitely fun, and it was everything I expected from having.
Yeah,
you
my
as a
pleasure,
guest.
man. This was an awesome
thanks
conversation.
So much for joining me.
I'm glad we had it.
Yeah, me too. So you can find Matt Harmon's work at NFL Network, at NFL.com, at the Fantasy Footballers.
Matt Harmon _BYB, still wearing that shameful BYB tattoo.
See, there you go. And you can find my work at www.mattwaldmanrsp.com. The 2018 RSP post-draft came out yesterday, so you can get that. And you get the pre-draft package along with it. And you can follow me at Matt Waldman. This was the RSP cast. Thanks for listening.